So we're going to have people continue to be trickling in, I believe, but we're going to get things started because we've got a lot of great voices that we want to be sharing and thoughts about the movie. So thank you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ben Martens, and I am the Executive Director of the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. And today we're going to be talking about Netflix's new film, Seaspiracy, which chronicles the journey of the star and director Ali as he tries to understand and solve the problems facing our world's oceans, basically. And so this controversial movie has gotten a lot of attention. It was trending in the top 10 of Netflix. And so we wanted to take a little time today to talk about some of the flaws in the film, some of the really good work being done locally and around the world to build sustainable fisheries, and why we think not including some of those stories and facts was a really huge missed opportunity for the broader scope of work that's being done to make things better within our fishing communities and for the ocean in general. And so we also want to answer some of your questions. So please make sure that if you have a question, we're going to try and keep everybody on mute. So if you have a question, put it in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat over there. So if you have a question, put it in the chat and we will try and funnel that through to our esteemed panel of guests who are going to be chatting about this project. So with that being said, thank you to this fantastic group of people who have come together to share some of their thoughts and reactions and hopes about this film. And so I want to start it off by asking you guys to introduce yourselves and give a few sentence kind of reaction to what you thought about the film when you first watched it. So Jessica, I'm going to start that off with you.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm Jess Hathaway. I'm the editor-in-chief of National Fisherman. It's really nice to see so many people here today. I'm really impressed to see so many names from Maine. It is an absolutely stunning day out there. So thanks again for being here with us. My first reaction, well, I had a lot of reactions to this film, and I've unfortunately now watched it twice. And first things first, I just want to get it out there that this is not about fishing. It's about eating fish, and specifically it's about scaring people away from eating fish. So if someone wanted to become a smarter seafood consumer, this is not the film for them. It's a visual confirmation of biases for veganism. And while I have no personal objection to veganism, it is generally a privileged position to be able to eat healthful diet as a vegan. So that was what I wrote about for National Fisherman, and that was definitely my big takeaway from this piece. And as a journalist, I was mortified by the tactics he used, and I felt like it confirmed this sort of fake news bias that we see a lot. This is what people think journalists do, and it is not at all what a good journalist does. So I'll hand it off.
Thanks, Jess, for kicking it off. Mike, you go next.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Ben. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to everybody for, as Jess and Bart have said, spending a little bit of this spectacular Maine afternoon staring into a computer screen and a Zoom screen, which we're all doing way too much these days. I am Mike Conathan. I have been working in the ocean policy space for a little over 15 years now, first in the US Senate for Olympia Snow from Maine. Then I was with the Center for American Progress for a while, and currently serving as a senior ocean policy fellow at the Aspen Institute, which is a DC and Colorado-based organization. And yeah, I mean, I shared a lot of Jess's reactions to this film. I think the things that really stood out to me in particular were a couple. First of all, it's obviously, the fake news of fishing, and I won't go deep in the journalism angle because Jess covered a lot of that. But it's a poor, terribly poor approach to looking at an issue by taking such a one-sided perspective and not showing anything really from the opposition, and the tactics that the filmmaker took of repeatedly calling and then barraging front offices and harassing receptionists on camera hardly stands for a true journalistic balance. But I think more to the point, from the fishing industry perspective, as someone who's worked in fisheries policy now for a good chunk of my career, I think there's just so many obvious omissions here. And the biggest one to me is that, in talking about the fisheries management techniques that were used, that have been used around the world and seem to be coming up short based on the filmmaker's perspective, never really talked about the reality of what we see here, particularly in the United States, which is that fisheries are extremely well managed here. And people have asked me for years what the best way to ensure you're eating sustainable seafood is. And to me, the answer is two words. It's very simple: buy American. We have, thanks to the laws that are in place and the enforcement capacity here in the United States, arguably the best managed fisheries in the world, certainly one of the best managed fishery structures in the world. And the fish that we catch in the US is sustainable, almost full stop. And so especially when that comes from places like the Gulf of Maine and organizations like Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. The local markets know what's what, and if you look for that country of origin label on your seafood packaging and you see product of the United States, you are 95% of the way to sustainable eating. So I'll pause there. I know there's a lot more to be said from the fishery standpoint from our fisheries expert. So Ben, back to you.
Thanks, Mike. Linda, you go next.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Ben. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. I'm Linda Benkin. I'm a commercial fisherman based in Sitka, Alaska. Fished for going on 40 years now. I'm also the executive director of the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association. I've served on the North Pacific Council and as a commissioner to the International Pacific Halibut Commission. So I guess bring a lot of experience from on the water and also from the fisheries management space to this conversation. And I would say, what the film did well was highlight that the oceans are complex, they're beautiful. I fish because I love the ocean. I love working on the water. I love being surrounded by the incredible wealth of marine life that is part of a thriving ocean here off Alaska. But the ocean is also stressed. And I think there was accuracy to that piece in this movie. And it's stressed by climate change, by pollution, and it's certainly stressed by illegal, underreported, and unmanaged fisheries. So I think it did a good job of highlighting that there's problems in the ocean. What it didn't do was give you any answers about where fisheries are well managed and what the difference is between industrial scale fisheries and small scale community-based fisheries. Even in those parts of the world where they highlighted these industrial fleets, there are also people who are living from the ocean, have lived and fed people from the ocean, as they said in the film, since time immemorial, but done so sustainably, or they wouldn't have done it since time immemorial. And the film did not draw out that difference or the commitment of people who live in communities and have depended on the ocean for a long time to keeping the oceans healthy. So I think that's where the movie really fell short. And I hope that's some places where we can help people understand the differences between well-managed fisheries in the US and unmanaged fisheries, illegal fisheries going on in other places, but also the small-scale people who are trying to do it right, even in those countries that were featured in the film.
Perfect. Thanks, Linda. I'm going to jump in and then I'm going to let Barton kind of round out the team. So as I said at the start, I'm the executive director of the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. And my experience is doing a lot of work with local fishermen, small scale fishermen in the state of Maine over the past 10 years. And honestly, like I went into this film really being with my guard up. And I finished watching it and I turned to my wife and I said, I feel pretty good about things right now after watching that film. And part of the reason why it was something that just kind of struck me was I know so many fishermen who are doing things the right way. And I know what's happening in the policy world in the United States, where we are managing based upon the best available science, where we are seeing the benefits of that work with rebuilding fish stocks. And there is still a lot of work to be done. That's why our organization was founded by commercial fishermen to make things better. But I I really felt as though, you know, there was a lot of flaws in the storytelling. There was a lot of flaws in the conclusions. But at the end of the day, it made me feel as though a lot of the work that we're seeing done around the United States is having a very real impact. And I don't think that that should be overlooked, and it really was. And that's really why I wanted to invite some of these folks together today to share some of the stories of successes where we've seen you know, fishermen and communities come together to try and make things better and succeed in making things better. And I really think that that's the forgotten piece of this equation, is that there are people who are having a real impact in making our oceans better, more sustainable, and making sure that we can eat fish today, tomorrow, and forever. You know, our idea of sustainability when we sit down and talk to fishermen is, well, I want to make sure that my kids can continue to go fishing and have more fish in the ocean than what I had when my dad stopped fishing or my mom stopped fishing. And so, you know, I definitely think that there's a lot of flaws in this storytelling, but there's also some reasons for us to reflect upon and recognize that there is a lot of great work and optimism locally and nationally in the United States and in other countries as well that have been doing great work. So, Barton, bring it together.
All right. I think I might have just a slightly longer intro because I think I'm providing sort of a cultural, I guess, context for this. You know, the other experts on this panel, far more expert than I to debate any of the certain points, but also these are the men and women who are actually on the water. It's their story that sort of is threatened by this. So my name is Barton Seaver. I'm a chef, a recovering chef and author. I live here on the jagged, ragged, delicious coast of Maine. I've had a trajectory from working in restaurants where I focused on sustainable seafood to working as an explorer for National Geographic Society, where I focused on how do we reduce our impacts on marine ecosystems? So a typical sort of sustainability vantage point. And I very quickly learned, though, that the end result of sustainability should be the endurance of thriving human communities. And so from a public health standpoint, I became interested in what is a thriving human. And for the last 6 years, I've been working on that in various universities. And my approach to this is really why seafood matters from many different vantage points. Just as a source of nutritious food, but also of economic opportunity, empowerment, the ability for us to stay in place within our heritages. And what I found so damaging about this film is that, well, it plays into a long-running narrative that seafood, which is, to me, it's the only food that's considered guilty before proven innocent, is an easy target because it is not understood by the general population. And though this nation, and I'll talk about this nation just because that is our audience here, though it was a movie focused on global fisheries, though this nation was founded upon, you know, the tempestuous waves of the North Atlantic and the men and women that fished cod underneath them, you know, we turned our attentions to a different ocean, one that rippled with amber waves of grain, and we became an agrarian nation that sort of lost contact with our coastal communities. And still to this day, I mean, we literally sing of farmers, you know, the amber waves of grain, the fruited plain. If I tell you to close your eyes and picture a family farm with undulating hills bathed in autumn splendor, setting sun with perfectly patterned rows of corn leading the eye towards that red barn paint fading white house paint chipping picket fence. Woo! You get it, right? I mean, this is the very thread by which the fabric of this country is woven, right? But if I ask you to picture a fishery, those on this call can, but for the vast majority of people, they might stand, you know, in their mind on a dock and gaze wistfully out at the wine dark sea, thinking as though a fishery is something that happens beyond the horizon, somewhere else, done by someone other. But a fishery is us. You know, you stand on that dock, yes, but you turn around, you look at the farms, and you look at the houses and the schools and the opportunity for a daughter to follow in 7 generations of bootsteps to take helm of that boat and her life there in the community. That is a fishery. And when we don't understand a fishery as a food system, we don't give it social license, meaning we don't credit it for the values and the virtues that it brings to our society, what happens is that it becomes ripe for disinformation. It becomes ripe for these sort of advocacy vantage points. And some of the information in this film was really very accurate. And some of the points that it raised are vital for us to consider, especially around animal welfare, around the state and health of our ocean ecosystems. But what was not discussed is the human impact of the consumption of seafood. What was not discussed was its relation to the rest of our diet. If we're not eating seafood, what are we eating? Well, in America, we're eating beef, pork, chicken, lamb, veal, and turkey, and over 200 pounds per person per year. We eat 16 pounds of seafood per person per year, and guess what? The American diet is killing us. So the idea to vilify seafood as guilty before proven innocent, when in fact, if you look at all these other spectrums, that we actually need to rationalize our diet, include more seafood, decrease red meat and other things, have a mostly plant-based diet. But there's this idea that seafood exists somehow in a vacuum because it comes from someplace other. And so that's what I found so dangerous and damaging about this movie, is that it continued to bolster that narrative that seafood is not relevant to our everyday lives. And that, in fact, is dangerous and detrimental to the communities represented here on this call. So, hey, thanks. Appreciate it. Look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Barton. I really, thanks for the concept and the background and a lot of the pieces that go into, like, fish is food, and it's part of our food system, both locally, regionally, nationally. And so, you know, Linda, you touched a little bit upon some of the things that the film got right. And I think that conceptually there was also some pieces of information that that it got wrong. But I do think it's important to recognize, like, there were some points of this film that they highlighted some problems. And so, Linda, I know you have a little experience in that, and Mike, some of your work on the high seas as well. And so I do just want to, like, take a moment to recognize that, like, there are problems. And I'd love to have, you know, both of you kind of weigh in on what some of those problems are, and then how we have addressed some of those problems in the United States.
Well, sure. I'm happy to start, Ben. And, you know, my focus is really on national policy, local policy, and then working with small scale fishermen around the world to help them address the problems they see happening off their coast and the impacts of this illegal unreported fishing. We all, I think, acknowledge that's what's going on in the high seas is really undermining the balance we try to find here in the US of having fisheries that do support local economies, that do keep our nation healthy with seafood, and keep the resource sustainable, while that's being undermined by illegal and unreported fishing that's happening generally outside the 200-mile limit of US jurisdiction. And there's a lot more that needs to be done to try and help people differentiate between fish that's coming into this country from other countries and where people can buy local seafood. I mean, I think as far as what people can do right now, less than 20% of the seafood we eat in this country is caught by US fishermen. So mostly what people are eating, if you're going to a store and you're not asking questions, it's seafood that's being imported, and probably imported from fisheries where we have a whole lot less control over how that seafood is harvested. I mean, the flip side of that is in developing countries, the 90 to 95% of what's harvested by small scale community-based fishermen is staying in those localities, is staying in those countries and being consumed locally. So yeah, you can probably count on, if you're not buying US seafood, you're buying seafood that may be part of the problem. So I think that is a really big issue, is the illegal unreported fishing. And then everything else that was touched on in the film. Marine plastics are a threat and a impact on the ocean that all of us need to wrestle with around the world. And climate change, ocean acidification, we're seeing it. I know you're in Alaska, I know you're seeing it in Maine. And there's much work to be done there to stop the emissions of greenhouse gases and address what we're doing to our oceans in that way. So I think that, that was a strength of the film. It did call out that the oceans are vulnerable and that they're really under a lot of pressure, and that it's really important for people to wrestle with some of these big issues. Where it didn't do well was help give people some solutions. And I think, as Mike said in his opening comments, looking for US seafood is a big part of that. And there's certainly lots to be done at the policy level to address what seafood comes into this country, how it's marked, and helping us put pressure on those fisheries that are not sustainable.
Mike, got anything to add on to?
Yeah, so in my work at the Aspen Institute, I focused quite a bit on high seas for a while, and management of the high seas. And of course, that gets to be a really difficult thing very quickly, because by nature, literally the high seas are international waters. There is no national jurisdiction for what goes on out there. And what we've seen increasingly, especially in countries where they either don't have the enforcement capacity to enforce fisheries sustainability regulations, or they simply don't have those regulations in the first place, as waters closer to shore get fished out, fishermen have to go further out from shore to find fish, and ultimately, without that type of enforcement and regulation, overfishing inevitably occurs. You fish out the waters that are close to you, you have to keep going further and further afield. And the film did touch on this a little bit when they were talking about the issue of slavery in the seafood industry, that increases costs, and that means that the industry has to look for ways to cut costs, and one of the ways is labor. So I think in some of these examples specifically where they talked about large scale illegal fishing occurring in international fisheries, they did actually a fairly good job of shedding a light on these issues. I've worked closely with an author named Ian Urbina, who was one of the journalists who initially broke the story of seafood slavery in a lot of these industries. And his book, The Outlaw Ocean, I would recommend to everyone. It tells lots of stories about seafood slavery is one, but lots of other ways that illegal and unreported activity goes on the high seas. And I also thought that the film, in touching on the way it did on some of the geopolitical implications of fisheries, that these are not issues that stay in just a fishery context. The issues along the coast of Africa in particular, where you have wealthy nations coming into areas that are poorly policed to poach fisheries. That's one thing that occurs. Another sort of more legalized version of that is that a lot of countries with less resources actually sell their fishing rights to China or to European nations in exchange for cash to go and potentially take care of other needs in the country. But often those governments are also corrupt, so that cash comes in, disappears into the country. The people who were living there, who were artisanal fishers, who were making their living and feeding their people, using their resources in their waters, are effectively pushed out. And in fact, in Somalia, that's what's led directly to the rise of piracy. So, there are lots of implications to this whole story. And, there's a million stories you can tell in that direction. So, I think that is one of the pieces that was valuable in the film, and I think it's something that we need to keep track of going forward. The issue of fisheries subsidies, for example, is another huge one that the United Nations is trying to deal with right now. Get subsidies out of fisheries. That's going to reduce overfishing and take the pressure off the fish stocks.
Thanks, Mike. So Jess, I see you got your hand up if you want to respond to this one. And then I'd also like you to kind of take us closer to home. I know that you had a great article that you wrote that kind of identified some of the weaknesses in some of the assumptions that were made that were not actually accurate. So if you'd also kind of answer, add your point here. And then if you want to transition to that, I'd love to start digging into some of the places that we had some problems with the film.
Yeah, that's actually sort of where I wanted to go with this, is that, someone mentioned in the chat, like what specifically makes this fake news. And the reason this piece I think is so dangerous is that it takes some actual truths. We have a plastics problem. We have a coral degradation problem largely as a result of ocean acidification. We have habitat destruction issues largely resulting from, shoreside development, farm runoff, pollution of all kinds of, all the modern trappings, right? Plane travel, ship travel, cars, and just, all kinds of industrial development that we have all over the world. Those are actual problems. Now, sinking them all on the fishing ship is one of the things that makes this extremely problematic, but also it introduces these sort of more dubious ideas with the actual problems, which makes people trust this piece as if it's presenting a whole range of truths, and that is not the case. And that's what really makes it fake news, is that it gets you to trust by acknowledging actual problems like plastics and then saying, well, 50% of the plastics in the Pacific Ocean garbage patch are from fishing nets. And that, as best I can tell, is based on one study that was actually using a trawl survey and aerial surveys. If you have ever pulled a net through the water, you know that it only can catch things that are smaller or larger than the mesh of the net. And the Plastic Pollution Coalition that they were interviewing actually said microplastics were the biggest component of the Pacific Ocean garbage patch. Well, you're not going to catch microplastics with your net, and you're not going to see them on an aerial survey. What you are going to see probably is nets. And so Greenpeace actually did a study that estimated fishing gear was about 10% of our plastics problem, which is still a problem, but it's not shocking considering that fishing gear goes in the water. All the other plastics typically are things that end up there from the rest of the stream that starts on land. So, you have all these, I'm trying to remember what the other one was, that myth of the fisheries are going to be depleted by 2050. I mean, that has been so soundly debunked that if you Google it, you see all the criticism of that study and the reasons it does not make sense. And we could go into details about why that doesn't, really, it's not sound science, but those claims are dubious and they cannot be proven, at least not now. And so introducing those with actual problems makes people believe that all these problems are going to be solved if we just stop fishing. And that ignores cultural issues. We have subsistence fishing, we have indigenous fishing. You cannot just tell everybody in the world to stop eating fish. It is a good quality protein, and it's not a cultivated food. It is just there as nature intended. So it's actually a lower stress on all of our resources to catch and eat wild foods.
The study that always is cited about the depletion of our oceans by 2045 or 2050 or whatnot. The authors of that study have retracted it at this point as well, saying that it's not doesn't hold up, that they use some inaccurate data. And to be fair, like, we have rebuilding stocks in the United States. We've been not everything is perfect. We have some outliers like Gulf of Maine cod and other things like that, but for the most part, we've seen some fantastic results from our science-based management when it comes to rebuilding our fish stocks in the United States. And that's not just the United States, that's a lot of parts of Europe as well, where we have seen rebounding fish stocks in really pretty dramatic ways. And so one of the pieces that they brought up was one of the scientists said, like, if you start to relieve pressure from our fish stocks, they rebound in amazing ways. And I think that we've seen that by not removing the fishing industry from the fishing communities from that equation as well. So I think that's a really great point, Jess, that you identified. Barton, you've got your hand up as well.
Just a couple of other, and Jess, thank you, by the way, for all of your work and your quick response to everything in your article. It was very helpful. And my great points as well. So getting to the health context of seafood, there was some mention in there that seafood is full of PCBs and dioxins and methyl mercury, which is true in very specific circumstances, and that not all fish is. And I think, again, that sort of blanket statement that scares people away from a dissection of what is a much larger and much more complicated truth. And in fact, that gets to be actually damaging to public health. So a colleague of mine who was at Harvard when I was the director of the health program there was Dr. Darius Mozaffarian, did a study around methyl mercury in seafood and a cost-benefit analysis as relates to the benefits of omega-3s in our diet versus the detriment of environmental toxicity. And along a curve, a graph that he did, there was only 3 species that actually fell above the cost-benefit analysis, and those were forms of shark, king mackerel, and marlins, which are not typically on the menu most time. Now, this is not to say that we should not be taking this seriously. Absolutely, especially vulnerable populations. Absolutely. But at the same time, we understand more and more so by some of those very same scientists the incredible importance of omega-3s in our diet. And so much so that Dr. Walter Willett, the former chair of the nutrition department at Harvard School of Public Health, claims that a lack of omega-3s in our diet is epidemic level. And if you look at heart disease and all the #1 killers in America, and the fact that omega-3s, as found in fish, are such a good combatant to that, the messaging in the movie is not only, it's accurate in a very acute way, but actually has these very damaging ripples in that it advises against seafood consumption, which our own government and health experts are in fact recommending increasingly more of. USDA guidelines are coming out, in fact, increase the recommendations, especially for pregnant nursing mothers. And then just one other point on just percentages. Dr. Ray Hilborn out of the University of Washington, one of the preeminent scientists around fisheries, has a great website, and I can post a link to it, but 77% of global fish, of global wild capture seafood supply comes from sustainable, biologically sustained fisheries. So that's where the science is. So when we start talking about these, dire situations, yes, absolutely they exist, but they also exist in this larger context of, well, we know how to do it, and some places are doing it right. Thanks.
Thanks. Linda.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, yes, there's lots of health benefits to eating fish. Agree 100%. And I guess part of what troubled me with the film identifying that there were these toxins in the fish is that what we really need to question is where those are coming from and what we can do to stop those toxins from washing into the ocean. And I would just highlight how often fishermen have been the spokespeople for saying, hey, putting this mine at the headwater of Bristol Bay where the toxins from mining can end up in our fish habitat and kill our fisheries. That's so often the voice for sustainable fisheries and for saying, let's do something to stop the flow of these damaging, whether it's coming from industrial, agricultural, or mining, or other impacts to fish habitat. So yeah, it's if you stop eating seafood, it does nothing about the poison that's coming into the ocean, does nothing to protect the fish. But the fishermen I work with, the fisherman Ben works with, others are generally the first line of defense for the fish, and speaking up to say we really do have to do something about those toxic chemicals that are entering our fisheries.
Thanks, Linda. So I just want to pause. If anybody wants to have a final word on this kind of topic, happy to let you jump in. And then I'd love to kind of jump to some questions that we've been starting to get from folks that have joined the audience. So Jess, Mike, anything further to add?
I'll just make one point that, I did find, as I was doing a little bit of, perusal, looking for articles on some of these topics specifically to get at some of these scientific studies. There was a lot of focus in the film on sort of the animal welfare issues, particularly as relates to marine mammals and turtles. And I just in the line of fake news statistics, I just wanted to add this one, that the sea turtle study, where they indicated that something like 250,000 sea turtles were being killed every year in U.S. fisheries. That number has also been resoundingly debunked by the scientific community. It actually comes from a study that was conducted before the U.S. required in their shrimp fisheries and other fisheries the use of turtle excluder devices to allow turtles to escape from shrimp nets. And in reality, the current catch any catch of endangered species is too high. Recognizing that fact, it's about 2% of that number. It's about 4,000 per year. So still working on making that better. But that's another thing that we see in this, and we can move to some questions in the chat. But I hope we get a chance to talk about some solutions potentially a little further down the road as we wrap up.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. And I do want to just that you opened that can of worms. One of the pieces of this documentary where they talked about observation, observers, and kind of some of the things that they suggested happen on the high seas. But in the United States, we do have data streams coming from our fishing vessels, and those data streams are of varying quality. But right now, on a certain percentage of trips, we put human observers on boats throughout the United States, and we have been moving more and more towards a system of high rates of accountability. And so the fishermen that we work with here in Maine, who catch things like cod and haddock and flounder, they actually, we've got almost all the boats we work with outfitted with cameras that are running 100% of the time and are collecting real-time data to not only inform science and management, but also get to that discard question that was brought up as part of this film. Like, what is being discarded? What happens to those discards? And one of the things that we've found is, as fishermen have identified discards as a problem, and we say we need a solution, they find those solutions. We've got some fishermen who they are trawl fishermen, so they drag a net through the water, and they rig their gear so that they only are catching what they want to be catching, and everything else goes back over the side. And it gets captured by the cameras, right? And right now, they are at less than 1% of what they are catching is going back into the ocean. And so it's really amazing what fishermen have been able to do, and how we've been able to build some of those feedback loops so that we not only are getting good data into that stream for our scientific assessments, but also so that we are creating a feedback loop of empowerment to the fishermen when it comes to accountability, et cetera. So Linda, you've got your hand up. Is that left over, or did you put it up?
No, I did put it up. I really wanted to follow up on that. So I know, like you, Ben, we have also worked hard to advance electronic monitoring as a way to capture data at sea from fisheries, particularly on boats that are too small to accommodate another person, an observer on the boat. And I just shout out to Erica Fuller, who's listening today. The National Fish and Wildlife Foundation has really supported a lot of that work, and it has generally been fleet led, because every single system has to work with a different fleet, and it takes the impact, that full cooperation of the fleet to help come up with systems that are workable. But I also wanted to add the other way that I know our fishermen have collaborated working with scientists and among themselves is to create very detailed maps of the seafloor, so bathymetric mapping, sharing data, giving us their data so we can compile it and get it back to them, which really helps them to avoid sensitive areas and to control their bycatch rates when they're fishing, so that they can very cleanly target what they're after while minimizing their catch of species known to be associated with certain habitat types. When they can see well where that habitat is, they'll stay out of it. So control their bycatch rates of rockfish, for example, which are long lived, slow to reproduce. So there is a lot, just, sort of getting to what Mike was saying, relative to solutions that fishermen are doing to be cutting edge in improving accountability in the sea and also improving best fishing practices within their own fleet.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to throw a couple questions. So this one, Jess or Barton, you might be best able to answer this. We have a couple people asking about the farmed fish portion of the film. I am not an expert in that side of the equation, but I'd love to, if you have anything that you were able to share about your thoughts on the farmed fish portion of that segment. I think there's a lot of people that are interested in what that actually looked like.
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on farm fish either, although I will say as far as National Fisherman is concerned, generally we consider ourselves a wild capture, domestic fishing magazine, but we do include bivalve aquaculture in our coverage because that is in a lot of ways replenishing formerly wild stocks of bivalves. So we don't really cover finfish aquaculture. It's just a very different beast. And I think it's really important, just as with wild fish and fisheries, not to paint aquaculture with that broad brush. There are there's a lot of variability. There are different ways of being managed. There are different ways of setting up your gear, whether or not it's on land or in the water. So I would encourage people certainly to read more about aquaculture, and I'm sure Barton can give some really good suggestions for places to get more info. But aquaculture is not all one thing, just like fishing is not all one thing. There's a lot of subtleties.
Barton, got anything to throw in there? You're on mute. Barton, you're on mute if you're, there you go. It's not a Zoom if you can't tell somebody that they're on mute. So.
Yeah, well, this is my first Zoom call, so I'm just figuring this out. Jess, great response. Thank you for that. I was very much anti-farmed fish for a long time, and for good reason, which was that the industry it just wasn't right. It was abusive. It hadn't found its footing yet. And there was a lot of ecological, environmental, social, cultural damages that were being wrought by what was really a very new industry. Farmed seafood as a global industry is really only about 50 years old. And if you think about other industries, a computer the size of the Pentagon 50 years ago couldn't do what my iPhone does. Cars were unsafe at any speed. And those early abuses have been answered. We now know how to sustainably farm many different species. Does that mean that farmed seafood across the board is good? Absolutely not. There are some terrible actors still using very antiquated processes. But bottom line is that it is a very youthful industry. It is very exciting in the progress that it is making. We're still figuring out what species to farm even. Think about agriculture. It's been 10,000 years since we domesticated the auroch down to the Holstein cow to this agricultural perfection. How many generations of chicken are we on? Well, we're on generation 50 of farmed salmon. What is left to still discover and grow towards is incredible. Again, most aquaculture is such a vast thing to consider as a singular entity and broad brushstrokes say it's bad. Again, it earned that bad reputation, but it's also earned, I think, the respect and it deserves to be reconsidered. And you look at organizations like Monterey Bay Aquarium and their sort of industry-leading seafood watch program, which recently greenlisted for the first time a net pen farmed salmon up in Norway. Greenlisted across the board recirc aquaculture system salmon, many of which are coming to Maine. So it's inappropriate to broad brushstrokes say aquaculture is bad, the same way it would be inappropriate to say, hey, there's salmonella on my spinach, agriculture is bad. It just doesn't make sense to do that. And in terms of the overall percentage of it, more than half of the seafood that we eat globally is farmed. So it is here to stay, and it's, I think, our responsibility to work towards improvement of it rather than where we have been for a long time, which is fighting against its existence. It is an industry that can live with wild fisheries and provide healthy, delicious food. Thanks.
Thanks, Barton. So another question that we've got is, since you brought up Monterey Bay, the certification of sustainability, some of the NGOs and those like legitimacy of what is sustainable versus not. Mike, I'm going to kind of toss this to you and see if you have any thoughts, and then maybe Linda or Jessica would also have some interest in responding to that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, everybody has a different definition of sustainability. That's where we are. There is not a sort of universally accepted definition of what it is. I thought in the film, the regulator from the European Union did a pretty good job of breaking it down. You put money in the bank, you want to live off the interest. It's an endowment thing. If you're not tapping into the endowment, if you're not taking down the base stock and you're living off the interest of what that produces, that's a pretty solid definition of sustainability. But across the board, it depends on where you are. I would say in fisheries in the US, that's how we manage, that's sort of the definition that we use for what a sustainable fishery is. If the fish population is at a point where it can sustain itself at a historically appropriate level, then you set the catch limits such that you don't cause that system to go into decline. That's sort of the typical definition of a sustainable fishery. I think in the film, I was frankly appalled at the way they treated the Marine Stewardship Council. I mean, I say what you like about the Marine Stewardship Council. Somebody has to set parameters. Somebody has to define what fisheries are operating in a sustainable fashion. Some fisheries, somebody has to sort of set that parameter. And they were really incredibly inaccurate in their portrayal of how MSC operates. It is a system that people have criticized, and often rightly so, but the reality is that the system works by allowing third-party certifiers to actually certify those fisheries. So if an MSC label is on a seafood package, it means that the Marine Stewardship Council is not the entity that decided that was sustainable. It was the third-party entity that was independent of the Marine Stewardship Council that audited that fishery and declared it to be sustainable. So, again, it's all in the way these things are portrayed, and that gets back to kind of my initial perception of this in that sort of fake news parameter. It's if you don't tell the whole story, you're not telling the story. And so you're leaving people with a false impression of what's actually taking place.
So Mike, while you're talking, we just got another question through the chat that's specifically to you. So about rebuilding and sustainability. And so for the United States specifically, because I know that's where we know the most, but are fish stocks not actually being reduced right now? Are they growing? What's happening with our trajectory of fish stocks in the United States?
So the way the law is set up currently in the United States is that the National Marine Fisheries Service has to set an annual catch limit for every fish stock that we manage. It's something like 500 and I don't know, it's a lot. So there's a lot of fish stocks that they have to set an annual catch limit every year. And that annual catch limit cannot be higher than a level recommended by the Science and Statistical Committee. So scientists get together, they assess the health of the fish population, they determine based on that assessment how many fish can be harvested, and then the Fishery Management Council set that catch limit at a level such that the recommendations of the Science and Statistical Committee are not exceeded. And if those limits are exceeded, then in subsequent years, there is payback. There are accountability measures to ensure that is not happening on an ongoing basis. And if in those assessments they find that that the fish population is in fact too low, then you have to set a rebuilding plan that must take no fewer than 10 years with a few potential exceptions. So this is unfortunately what we're facing with a species like Gulf of Maine cod right now. which was historically overfished, particularly through the 80s, and probably for decades prior to that, before we really had a lot of strong sustainability standards or frankly good science to understand the status of those populations. And for a number of factors, that population has not been able to rebound. And part of that is that a ground fishery operates as a multi-species fishery. So unless you shut the whole fishery down for cod, haddock, flounder, hake, redfish, 13 species, 16 different fish stocks, you're going to have to allow some fishing to continue to occur, and some mortality of cod is going to be inevitable. Also, climate change is playing a tremendous role in the Gulf of Maine right now. It's warming faster than 99% of the waters anywhere on the planet. And that, as a result, is making it harder for cod that's already at the southern end of its range to continue to rebuild. So that's an issue that we're currently trying to deal with in fisheries management, is how do we deal with this issue of shifting stock populations, and how does that affect a level of sustainability? So as you can see, I mean, it gets really complex really fast. So, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but that's sort of a short answer there. I think Jess and maybe Linda want to jump on that too.
So Linda, you've had your hand up the longest, and then Jess, so go ahead, dive in.
Sure, yeah, I just wanted to, I guess a couple things Mike said there, new ideas kept jumping into my mind. But yeah, thanks for great comments. Just going back to MSC, I do really appreciate the work that was done to create a system with the third party to review. And I think it has become a bar for people and a brand to look for. And that's played a very important role in also encouraging people to think about that and what it takes to be sustainable. And I would say it is a fairly rigorous process. There are a lot of questions that are asked and a lot of digging that has to go on in the scientific community often to answer all those questions, which isn't to say it can't be improved. I think there's a growing awareness that sustainability has to include a social equity component, environmental justice, and that's an aspect of sustainability that's probably been overlooked a little bit too long in management of fisheries as well as management of lands and other aspects of our country and internationally. So I think that's a place that the MSC can evolve towards, as well as our fishery management system. I also, I think, wanted to add to what Mike said about shifting stocks, or about stocks that were possibly overfished, or if they are in a space where they need more protection. There are some jurisdictional problems right now, I think, that councils face in making sure that fish remain sustainable, that they're responsible for managing, in that the jurisdiction of fishery management councils ends at federal waters. And often the impacts to a fish stock, I think, as I was saying before, might be coming from the time they spend in a lake or an estuary or a river where there is less jurisdiction to take care of that habitat. So certainly at this point, particularly as we face climate change, there needs to be a reach across essential fish habitat that ties together those jurisdictions and make sure there's coordination between agencies to achieve that kind of sustainability.
Great stuff, Linda. Jess.
Hi, I hope that I'm coming across okay. I'm getting some warnings about my internet being unstable. My internet's trying to push me outside. So I just wanted to add that, certainly we can criticize MSC. No system is going to be perfect. And I personally have criticized MSC because I think also huge entities need to be criticized and constantly, striving to be better. So one of the problems with this film is that it takes worst case scenarios and then extrapolates them to be bigger than they are. You can't take a single Icelandic fishery and say they have X amount of bycatch, and now if you extrapolate that across the world, that's how much bycatch you have. And this film literally does that. And you cannot take the worst case scenario of all the fisheries that MSC has labeled and say, this is the problem with MSC. This is how they manage fisheries, or how they manage their program. And that's just not true. And I also think it's a uniquely human egotism to imagine that we understand what the perfect balance of all of these fisheries should be. You know, we certainly know when fish are in sort of a danger zone because of high landings, but not every fishery that is, you know, considered overfished in this country is being fished. You know, the fish can have low stocks because of habitat loss, because of pollution and shoreside development. They can be moving because of climate change, because their food is moving, or the water temperature is not ideal for them to reproduce there. So this idea that, you know, well, yes, cod is overfished now, and that's a problem because we overfished it. Yes, we can acknowledge that, but cod is not coming back, not because we're still fishing it. It's not coming back for a whole range of reasons. And we can completely stop fishing cod. It doesn't mean it's going to come back. So I think we also have to be careful to not imagine that we know so much about the oceans that we can say this fishery should be at this number in order to be considered sustainable. That's why U.S. fisheries are always being managed for sustainability. We are always learning and we're always striving to do better. And that's really the point that I wish this film had made, is that, you know, if you want to be a smart seafood consumer, start looking for these things, not stay away because all these things are too scary to imagine.
Yeah, I think one of the great just ways to kind of put that in perspective is we learned a lot about the bluefin and the tuna industry in the Pacific in this film, right? And they really focused on one aspect of that fishery. They talked about the bycatch issue when it came to marine mammals. There's a lot of pieces of that were pretty damning and not a great look. And then we have another tuna fishery off of our Atlantic coast, which is primarily a small scale, small boat fishery where you know, fishermen use hook and line or harpoon, electric harpoon. Like, so it's a very small scale fishery, and that population is rebuilt, right? And so that's a bluefin tuna off Atlantic coast. You can feel really good about choosing that if you're sourcing from local sources. And so I think that's where, like, that smaller, you know, taking the big picture and understanding how they fit into that equation is really, really important. The nuances of fishing, just like any part of our food system, is incredibly important. And you know, we're getting close to the end of our time here, and I really appreciate everybody taking that time to be with us. And I think my big kind of closing push, and I'll ask everybody else to kind of give their minute spiel, is you know, watching something like this and having the conclusion be, do not eat seafood, do not eat fish, is the same conclusion that you might get to if you're watching a documentary about any other part of our food system. All of our food systems have problems. They have their warts, they have their issues. And, you know, I've watched documentaries that talk about what happened in, you know, the beef and cattle industry, or like large scale agriculture. And the place that I got to after watching those was like, I need to get to know the people who are growing my food. I need to be sourcing locally. I need to be sourcing sustainably, and I need to be asking questions about what I'm eating. And, you know, that's at the core of where I got to in this film, and why I actually, you know, I thought it was a great teaching tool to be able to put this out there and say, yes, there are problems, but we are working to correct those problems, and you can be a part of that solution by choosing correctly, by eating local seafood, by eating sustainable seafood, and empowering the people who are fighting the good fight to make things better. And so, you know, that's my closing thought. Mike, Barton, Linda, Jess, I want to give you guys a minute to kind of bring us home. So Mike, why don't you go first?
Yeah, as long as I don't have to go after Barton, that's fine. I'm happy to kick
We
it
might
off
just
first.
cut Barton out so that we all look better.
So yeah, I mean, I just want to take a quick minute. I think I want to talk a little bit quickly just about what some solutions to some of these problems are, because the reality is we're getting much closer to having solutions to these issues, specifically in terms of monitoring, of knowing what's happening on the water, because I think that gets at the core of a lot of the issues related to fishing. You know, I won't address plastics for now. I won't address the marine mammal issues other than in this bycatch context. But I think the more that we can know about what's happening on the water, the more we're going to be able to manage fisheries the right way, and the more we're going to be able to sustain, maintain, rebuild ocean health. And so that involves, Ben talked about electronic monitoring. There's also a lot of satellite monitoring capacity that now exists. And there's an organization called Global Fishing Watch, which can actually track boats if they have satellite transponders, and in some cases just track them by their running lights, by watching satellites from space, drawing patterns on a map, seeing where the boats are fishing and when they're fishing, and understanding the interplay and the relationships there. Technology is our friend in this regard. And I think the other piece that's really important that we need to talk about as well is marine protected areas. And we do have to have areas of the ocean where no fishing exists. And we have to figure out a representative sample of ocean ecosystems for purposes of science, for purposes of understanding what the ocean does when it's left alone, and for purposes of allowing the stocks to rebuild in those areas so that we understand what healthy ecosystems actually look like and can set some parameters for what we're really shooting for. But at the end of the day, fish is great protein. It's delicious. It's something that we all need to be putting more of in our bodies. And I'll leave the rest of that to Barton and the other folks to talk about. So thanks for having me, Ben.
If I could, I just say, Ben, I would reiterate your sentiments. You said that very well, and I so admire the work that all of our fellow panelists have done. Linda and Jessica, you bring such incredible expertise to this. Thank you for sharing. I've learned a lot. Ben, I'm with you. I'd say, boycotts are very effective, and that's what this movie was calling for. But equally effective, and I think even more so, are boycotts. Support those who you want to see succeed. Let the example flourish so that it becomes the norm. And there's a lot of great things happening for a lot of great reasons, and the result is thriving humans who are a product of the resilient ecosystems in which they live. So thanks. I really appreciate you having me join today.
Linda.
Yeah, thank you. And I would pick up on that theme, I guess, of I think one of the things I've learned from work running a small boat on a big ocean is the need for humility in facing powers that are greater than ourselves, and a complexity that goes well beyond our understanding, and that we need as a species to learn to live within planetary ocean limits. And that applies to how we live when we're working on in the ocean or working in the land. And where we have examples who are doing it, of people who are doing that well with sustainable fisheries, regenerative ranching, sustainable farming, those are the examples, those are the producers of food that you want to support, and you want to support them with your consumer dollars and help them to be successful, help the rest of us learn to follow that example. And in finding a way to reintegrate ourselves into ecosystems sustainably, we ensure that the planet and ourselves have that kind of a sustainable future. And I would just have to say that's one of my concerns with the approach to marine protected areas, is that we will set these areas off limits because we don't have a place over there while we continue to do what we're doing over here, because we don't know how to do it well enough to not undermine the productivity of the systems that sustain us. I want to see us learn how to live within this system of this planet without undermining its sustainability. So that's my goal, and that's what I work towards every day. And I work that direction with a whole lot of fishermen around the world who share that same commitment to ocean health, social equity, all that we need to learn from living well on this planet. So thanks so much for hosting this, and Ben, and to all the other panelists for being part of it, and to everyone who has joined us here today.
Jess, bring us home.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Linda. I feel like I've seen Linda more on Zoom this year than I would normally see her in a regular year, even at fishing events. So I just want to say thank you to Ben and to Monique, who's been running things in the background, and to your whole staff at MCFA for pulling this together. It's been really great. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I know that we're sort of at varying levels trying to explain things to people who might just be getting an intro and people who already, understand fisheries really well. So I hope that this has been a good conversation for all levels. But I just wanted to quickly go back to that, the NPA thing, and something that really stood out to me in this piece, in this film, was that he literally says less than 1% of our oceans are being regulated, which assumes that to be regulated, the ocean has to be completely cut off from fishing, which is preposterous. We have sustainable fisheries in the United States because all of our oceans are regulated here. And that is, fishery management is a regulation, and BOEM also regulates our territories in the water. So, to suggest that 1% of our oceans are being regulated is inaccurate. And then also suggesting that, the regulation is to limit sea kayaking is preposterous. So, to reiterate Linda's point, it's about learning to live with what we have and how best to operate within those confines. And certainly we are confined, and we're learning more and more about our oceans and our fisheries and what we can sustain. But, the US landings were almost 10 billion pounds in, I think it was in 2017. And that's enough to feed every US citizen half a pound of fish a week for a whole year. And granted, that includes menhaden and includes shells and fish heads and all that. So that number is not entirely accurate for what you would really eat for fish, but that's still a lot. And that's, that's really something to think about. We can feed the globe with what we have in the oceans if we manage it well.
Well said, Jessica. Thank you, everybody who stuck with us this afternoon. It was so great to see all your faces. And please, this is ongoing work. We need a lot of, eyeballs that care about this stuff. So you can visit our website to learn more about the work we're doing. Barton has got a fantastic couple of books about how to cook seafood, how to learn about seafood. Linda's got some fantastic resources. And Jessica runs an entire magazine about seafood issues and fishing issues. So please, stay informed, stay in touch, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you, everybody.